Hello, happy Friday to everybody. This is the 47th Automation Hour, and we're glad to have you on. If you are joining us for the first time, all lines are muted, and actually we are not going to use the chat function. We're going to point you to the Success Community Salesforce Automation Hour. There is a link that Rakesh has posted that will go directly there, so post your questions there, and we'll have Michelle or any of us take your questions, and then we'll answer that. So it's out on the community as well. And then after the session, we will post the recording as well as the link to the deck out on YouTube, and then communicate that out on our Trailblazer Community Salesforce Automation Hour, as well as automationhour.com. So here are our upcoming sessions. So today's we have Michelle Hansen on, and we have some great sessions for the rest of the year. We're booked out, and we recently added October 26th, so we have MVP Cheryl Feldman coming back and showing some of the cool stuff that she has worked on too. So all the links are on automationhour.com for you to register. And we wouldn't be here without our sponsor, Concrete.io, so thank you for bringing this free webinar series to the Salesforce ecosystem. And here are your co-hosts, David, myself, and Rakesh from last year's Dreamforce, and we hope to see you all at this year's Dreamforce. And with that, we're excited to have Ohana on, Michelle. I've seen her out on Twitter, the Trailblazer community, Slack, helping folks out on process automation questions. So we're excited to have her on to share her experience with process automation with this crowd. So let me hand off to Michelle. You should have presenter right now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Apparently, it's wanting to be difficult as far as sharing a screen here, so give me just a minute. All right. Jen, is the agenda up? Are we able to see the agenda? Okay, fantastic. Yep. Okay, so briefly what we'll go over today is just what are your different choices for automating processes. We'll go through what they are and maybe when you want to use those. And then we'll go through my company's automation use case, which relates to proposals that we create and a custom object I built. Then I'll discuss the process I went through on actually automating this and the lessons I learned, and then I'll do a quick demo to show you what actually came out of it in the end. So automation is a process. One of the things I have definitely learned is that sometimes you just got to go with the flow. Certainly there are things that you think you've got down that you find out you don't. And you just kind of learn as you go along. So I am definitely not a developer. I have been a Salesforce admin for probably about 6 years now, definitely more comfortable on the declarative side of things. So when it comes to automation, on the declarative side, you have three choices. You've got workflow rules, the process builder, and flow. So the question then becomes, well, what's the difference between those? And which one do I need for my specific use case? So the first one we can talk about is workflow rules. And essentially, it's kind of like a validation rule in how you write it, but you put your formulas or your criteria in there, and then you can do certain things with them. And from that, you can do you can create a task. So you can assign that task to a user, a role, or a record owner, for example. You can send an email alert. So maybe you want to notify, certain people if an opportunity is won. You could write a workflow rule for that. You can do an update to a field. So if you need to update a status, maybe from pending to in progress or completed or something like that, you can do that. You can also use them for outbound messages, which is one of the kind of special things about a workflow rule. I don't think the other two can do those. Now, to be honest, I have not spent a lot of time with workflow rules. I'll have to echo what Jen said in a presentation once, that pretty much she pretends that workflow rules just don't exist. I've kind of jumped on that train with her, so where I spend most of my time is in the other two, either Process Builder or Flow. So with Process Builder, it's a much more user-friendly interface as far as I'm concerned, and it's got a lot more flexibility on what you can do. You can have it do things immediately, or you can actually schedule actions to happen at a later date from whenever that process got triggered. So maybe you need something to happen 3 days from now as opposed to right this minute. You can also create records, not just update them. You can invoke one process from another process, so that gives you the flexibility to kind of daisy chain these together if you need multiple things to happen. You can create chatter posts, use quick actions. You can launch flows, so if you've got a more complicated process, it's a nice way to launch those. And then you can also send emails. So then finally, with Flow, or visual workflow, or what you use the Cloud Flow Designer for, you've probably heard it mentioned multiple ways. There's a number of things that you can do. You've got your internal or external actions. The key here is really that you can include user interactions. Processes are just things that you need to have happen automatically behind the scenes. But what if you need your users to enter a specific piece of information on a screen that then determines what you need to do? Well, Visual Flow can do that because you have the user interaction piece. You can also create records and update records with Visual Flow, but you can also look up existing records or delete them. So you've got a lot more flexibility with that when it comes to Flow. Just like processes, you can call a different flow from a flow. So if you need to daisy chain processes together, or if you have a use case where you want to be able to do an action frequently, you can create a subflow and then just call that from multiple other flows so you don't have to write the same flow over and over again. And then you can do email alerts and quick actions just like you can with Process Builder, and also a static action. So I can actually create an email that is a static email as opposed to using my email alerts and my templates if I want to send an email to someone. I use that a lot for kind of like faults or errors when I want it to email me that there's something in the system that needs my attention as an administrator. So that's just kind of a brief overview. There's tons of resources out there that can definitely get you started with it. But that's some of the things that I take into account when I'm figuring out which automation tools to use. So what was my use case? What was I trying to do? Well, I work for a technology cooperative called National Information Solutions Cooperative. We go by NISC, not to be confused with the hit CBS TV show NCIS. But what we do here is we sell software solutions to telephone or utility companies. So your electric provider, your cable provider potentially, they all need software to be able to track their customers and run their business, and that's the software that we write. So we are cooperative, we have member owners, and we are across all 50 states, Canada, and we have a couple of members in the Pacific as well. Over the past 50 years, we have grown quite a bit. So we now have roughly 75 products in our solution set. Then that translates out to about 150 SKUs, or different products that we have within Salesforce to use. And we're getting requests from 9 different sales managers. So there's a lot for our operations department to kind of manage because you can build bundles however you want to make sure that the solution set works for our prospect. So here's where we ran into a challenge. When the sales manager requests a proposal from our operations group, they would do it through Salesforce. We would go look and find a bunch of information that was missing. So the sales operations team goes back to the sales manager and says, hey, sales manager, I'm missing, pieces of information A, B, and C. Can you please fill in the blanks? So the sales manager turns around and asks the customer, who then responds back to the sales manager, who then updates sales ops. So if you guys ever played the game of telephone as a child, you kind of know how this goes. And when it came to the sales manager getting back in touch with sales operations, they may have made a phone call. It might have been through email. we started using Chatter. So Chatter posts were there, text messages. We've got 4 different offices, so sometimes if they're in the same office, they'll just stop by someone's desk. I'm fairly certain at some point there was probably even smoke signals or carrier pigeons being used to transfer that information. Really, the end result of this is we had a lot of chaos. You never knew where to find the update. You know, if somebody wasn't watching all of the different communication channels, you could potentially miss that update. And it was causing a lot of issues with proposals taking a lot of time as we went back and forth trying to get all this information. So, being the admin that I am, I said, well, hang on, there might be something that we can do with this in Salesforce to streamline the process and standardize it as well. So, you know, Salesforce to the rescue. What I thought we would do is we would build a custom object that we started to call our SOSs, or Services Outside of Standard. I actually kind of like the play on the name because essentially this is something that we need additional help on, so it's an SOS. We do things with this in 2 primary categories. Number 1, we track special requests from our customers. So if you're moving from one system to the other, you want to be able to convert some of your history so you're not starting with a blank slate. And generally, we have a certain number of years that we will transfer over as part of the implementation. If they would like to go back farther, let's say they have 20 years of data they'd like to keep, then we need to track that because it's going to cost a little bit more time and money-wise to be able to do that as part of the project. Also, while we do try and be kind of an enterprise provider, a lot like Salesforce offers many different clouds for many different use cases, it doesn't necessarily bridge everything. So we do have opportunities to integrate with other third-party software applications, much like we can download different apps from the App Exchange or have partners with Salesforce as well. So being able to track that and make sure that it is a vendor that we've worked for before and we can actually integrate our software, or do we need to write some new API or special code to do that? We also use it to track missing information. So part of our software is the document management piece. So one of the questions we need to know is, do you have an existing set of documents that we need to import into the new system? Because if you do, they need to be in a proper format. Also, things like how many licenses do you need? Something that we get asked a lot on the Salesforce side, you know, how many licenses do you need for your org? What kinds of licenses are those? We ask those same types of questions for our software. So we know not necessarily at the beginning of the sales process do we know all this information. So we can still provide some ballpark pricing, give them kind of an estimate. But as we go through that sales cycle and get closer to final contracts, we need to make sure we have all of our I's dotted and all of our T's crossed. And these help us make sure we've done that due diligence. So as we continue to grow from the 10 or so products that we had when we first started out to the more than 50 we have today, actually closer to 75, the more SOSs became necessary. So as the workload started to increase, it got harder and harder for our sales team to kind of keep up. So then I got the question, well, you could just create those for us, you know, that'd be great. And I'm sure I probably felt a little bit like the guy from Office Space did when his boss came out and asked him to work the weekend. However, you know, I'm feeling pretty good about me being a Salesforce admin, and so I'm sort of feeling like this guy, I'm a superhero, you bet I can do this. No problem. So I started with Plan A. And Plan A, when looking at all the requirements, was to use Process Builder. And it seemed like a really good fit. I needed to be able to trigger this on the creation or editing of a record in Salesforce. I needed different criteria to determine what I wanted to do, so I could use the little entry criteria diamonds in Process Builder to do that. I needed to create a related record. That seems like it's not a problem. And then I needed to update a related record to the record that fired my process. So all of those things could be handled by Process Builder with no problem. Seemed like a no-brainer. This was the way to go. So I went over to Process Builder and I started building. And as you can see, I started building every single one of these individually. So I have roughly 60 or so of my 90 processes that are all centered around this SOS creation. And so as you see, it just keeps going and going and going as far as how many processes that I created. And I soon learned a very important lesson. So what I really kind of gained from this is that automation is definitely a process. You're going to try something, you're going to fail at it, you're going to try again, probably multiple times, and then eventually you will succeed. And whether it's a question of, do I have the right variable, or am I looking at the right field, or have I written my formula correctly for whether or not this is supposed to fire, there's always some little quirks that you're going to run across, and eventually you'll get there and you'll succeed. And the first time I wrote it with process builders, I failed. So some of the things that I learned. Number one, there's differences in formula behavior, and they don't cover every single scenario that you want. So I had this on created or edited, and I wanted to make sure that it didn't reevaluate every time a record was edited. So I decided to put in a value of, if the specific field changed, then that's where you could enter the criteria node and determine the action that needed to be taken. What I hadn't realized is that is changed does not apply on a new record. So you needed to add in a condition for is new. So if the record didn't exist and now it does, that is a different formula than did a field change from value A to value B, even if value A was a blank. The order of execution. As you saw, I started writing all of those processes individually, and there was no way for me to determine which process went first. So if I had multiple processes that layered on top of each other, and one process updated a field and then a second process came behind it, and that field value would determine whether the second process should run, I had no way to control whether process 1 always happened before process 2. The biggest issue that I encountered is there is a limit of 50 processes per object, and I had closer to 60 processes that I needed to create. So I quickly found out when I ran into my limit of 50 that there were some documents out there talking about best practices for creating process builders, and one of them is to have either a single or maybe 2 processes per object. And the theory with this is it's much more like Apex coding, which is something that a lot of admins aren't really necessarily familiar or comfortable with, but it makes sense because basically you package everything up into one trigger, and then you can determine what happens based on criteria from there. So the same thing happens with a process. You can use all of those criteria nodes, which I believe you can have up to 200 in a single process. And then you have one process that contains everything that happens on create for that particular object, and then a second one that happens on edit for that object. So if you have some differences between the two of those, you can certainly specify that. Then there's also a little checkbox in your process that says execute actions only on specified changes. And that's part of the reason why I went with the formula behavior of is new versus is changed, because that execute actions only on specified changes has some quirks. One of the biggest ones that I found is that the record has to go from not meeting any of the criteria in your process builder to then meeting it. So if I had multiple stages that it could potentially be at that would trigger a certain action in my process, and it moved from stage A to stage B, both of which met the criteria, it wouldn't fire my process. So that was another one of those lessons that I'm like, oh, okay, I have to figure out a way around that as well. So that's when I started building all of them into some more condensed processes, just using 1 or 2 per object. And so one of the important things that I learned about through this process is this little node right here called evaluate the next criteria. Every time I'd seen this before, it always defaulted to stop, and I thought, okay, it was you pick which one of these you go into, it goes through all the actions that are either immediate or scheduled, and then you're done. But what I learned is actually you can have it evaluate multiple criteria nodes in succession, which means you can order how your process fires. So if you need one thing to happen before another thing happens, you can do that. You can reorder these as you need to add more processes, and it helps make sure that everything fires in the appropriate order. So I got it all done. I told my users it was happening. We did a great big launch. I tested it one more time, and it crashed and burned in production. I was mortified. I thought I had tested every possible iteration and permutation of this to make sure that all of my bases and scenarios were covered. The one thing I hadn't done is tried absolutely every single part of the process at the same time. So if they actually needed follow-up on more than 50 different fields, it actually hit what's called a governor limit. So this is where we go back to that try, fail, try, succeed. Turns out that my success was short-lived because I had failed to account for being able to bulkify my process. So the biggest thing I learned with that is that Process Builder is subject to governor limits. And basically what a governor limit is on a high level, I'm definitely not the expert on this, but because Salesforce is a multi-tenant environment, all of us use the same Salesforce platform to run our different orgs. The runtime engine strictly enforces limits to ensure that no one org is monopolizing those shared resources. So if some process or Apex code or something starts to monopolize or exceed a limit that's been set, basically it's called a governor limit because it's governing how many of those processes that you can kind of borrow at a time. So this is where I needed to understand a little bit more about bulkifying the process. And apparently that's a real word I hadn't heard until I watched one of Leah McGowan-Hare's Intro to Apex sessions. But what Process Builder does is it individually looks up records, creates records, or updates records. So every time it does one of those things, it's creating a call to the database. And Salesforce basically says that you can only have right around 100 of those for any one process batch. And if I was doing that with more than 50 records, I was updating more than 50 records, and I was doing more than 50 updates to a record and creating more than 50 records, and so that made me hit my limit. So then it was time for plan B. And that's when I decided it was time to maybe go with the flow. So instead, I can call it from Process Builder, so I don't need to have any user interaction. They can still just fill out their process or their proposal request according to the process that we've set up. And then behind the scenes, all of this is going to happen. The decision element within Flow could mimic that entry criteria node so that I could determine what actions needed to be taken based on the contents of the record. And because of the ability to do a fast update, I managed to cut the number of calls to the database in half because I could actually create one element to do a record update, even though I was updating more than 50 fields at a time. So some of the lessons I learned about using flows. Resource types. There's a lot in there that you have, and it's kind of difficult at the beginning to understand what all of these are and how you use them. So I'll actually go through that just a little bit, since that's something that I've seen several people struggle with, and it's useful to have kind of that explained. Also, naming conventions. Much like in code, which again, I am the declarative admin, not real familiar with code. There's some good naming conventions that are out there for how you use your variables, your formulas, decision outcomes, things like that, as well as the flow requirement that everything have a unique name. So you have to be a little creative sometimes. And details. You need variables for everything. Every field that you want to be able to look at or touch or modify. If you look up a record, any fields on that record, you have to explicitly state that you're looking for the values in those. Descriptions. I know you hear this all over the Salesforce admin world. Add a description. But especially if you're using naming conventions for your variables, it's incredibly helpful for you to understand, what does this specific element do? Is this a variable that holds a record ID? Is it a placeholder for something that the user has entered? What is this particular thing for? And then finally, essentially you're building kind of like a flowchart in Flow. You've got to make sure that all of your outcomes are accounted for, because when you get to the last box, Flow doesn't know where to go from there. So if you haven't accounted for every possible outcome from your elements, it's going to basically run into a stopping point. So resources, variables. Essentially, a variable can store something that you want to manipulate, either using an assignment. So maybe I have a variable for account name equals Acme. You can query them in a decision as well. So does this text string include the name John? It's also something that you can use to create an update record. So two of the things I use it for are text strings, certainly, and then number variables I use a lot for loop iterations. How many times have I gone through a loop to know if I should keep going through or maybe stop and do something else. A collection variable stores multiple items of the same type that you can manipulate or query individual using loops. So something like if I have a lot of text strings, so colors, for example, I can put all of my colors into a collection variable, and then I can loop through them one by one and find out which colors are primary colors. And then based on that, do one thing for primary colors and do something else for my secondary colors. So that's what you use a collection variable for. So an SObject variable is basically a special type of variable in Salesforce, and the SObject stands for a Salesforce object. So it essentially is designed to hold a standard or custom object record from Salesforce, and just one of them. So for example, the Acme Inc. account or the opportunity of 40 widgets for Acme. It's nice because as that SObject, you can pull the different fields and not have to declare variables for each one of them. You can just declare the fields on that object that you want to be able to use and then use them later on in your flow for one thing or another. So along the same lines, an SObject collection variable stores multiple Salesforce records of a single object type. So I can pull a list of accounts owned by Susie sales rep, put them in a collection, and then go through them one by one and manipulate them all in some way. Or I can look up all of the contacts that are related to the Acme Inc. account, and again, go through those one by one and manipulate them somehow. So when I was done, the results of my flow had 3 fast lookups, 47 decision elements. It created 51 different records potentially, and had 1 fast update. So over here on the side, this is the monster version of what my flow ended up looking like. And I know it's completely impossible to see, so I just pulled one little subsection of it up for us to take a look at and kind of understand how I went through the flow. So the first thing I did is when a proposal request record was saved, I would look up that record and find specific pieces of information that I wanted out of it, specifically the related opportunity. And so then when I would find the related opportunity, I would look that record up so I could pull some additional information from it. And then I would also look up the related account. So I've got 3 levels essentially in Salesforce where I'm looking up the records to find the information that I want to be able to inform all of my decision elements. So from there, we start going down my decisions. And so each of these are tied to a different field or combination of fields on my proposal request record. So is there a subsidiary company that we need to look at potentially? Is this first one here? If the answer is yes, then we're going to come over here and it's going to go to a record create element. So I'm going to actually create that SOS record that says we need to gather the requirements that are needed for this additional company. And then I used an assignment element here to update a checkbox on the opportunity that I created a record for this. So that way, if there are multiple proposal requests submitted throughout the life cycle of a sale, it won't recreate that SOS. I'm basically stopping duplicate creation. And so then once it's done, if it's gone through this, you can follow the arrow down to the next decision and it continues to go through the logic there. Also, the default outcome, which in this case would be no, is the other part of that puzzle. You know, there's always at least 2 outcomes for a decision. So if yes, this, otherwise this. So if there's not an additional company, you can skip through the rest of that line and go to your next criteria for decision. And so basically that's how the rest of the flow was built. So from there, then I used the process builder functionality to be able to call a flow. And so you can see I've got a couple of different criteria nodes within my proposal request created process. So anytime the record is created, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to make sure that the proposal was saved. and that's just basically the no criteria, execute the action, and it's going to launch my flow. So that's the first thing it's going to do. So same thing happens on edit. So I went with the 2 processes per object, and 1 on create, 1 on edit. So, and again, you can see the first thing it does is it launches my flow, then it goes through the rest of my criteria after that. Okay, so real quick, we'll shift gears and I'll jump over into my sandbox and kind of show you how this came about in practice when we were done. So here we are on an opportunity record for 123 Telecom. They want to be a new member of our company. So we've got an opportunity here. I can see exactly how much it's worth, what stage we're in, some of the other information, what division or what kind of company they are. So in this case, it's a telecom because they have to answer different questions than a utility company would, for example. And so now I can go ahead and I can create a proposal request. So I went ahead for the sake of time and filled all this out ahead of time. But there's a number of different things in here that are going to trigger the creation of those SOS records. So as I scroll through here, if there's additional trips that we need, maybe it's a complicated site or they have multiple offices, I actually have a checkbox in several different places for my sales managers to say, this is an area of question. We need to follow up on this and solidify our answers. So if I check that box, that will actually create a record. As I scroll down through the rest of these, this is a pretty big request form. We do offer the ability for them to put in services that are outside the normal services that we see. So for today's demo, I have a little bit of a sense of humor. So one of the services that we're going to say this new telecom offers is the ability to send prank calls to people on their birthday or Halloween, potentially. So we need to make sure that we have tracking ability in our software to do that, and we may need some custom development. So depending on what their requirements are as far as hardware, we can host it and do kind of a software as a service, or they can potentially put their own hardware on site if they want. So there's different considerations there to make sure if they want software as a service, they have appropriate internet connectivity and everything else to be able to make sure they can access the software. And so as we continue down here, there's quite a few of these that are going to trigger different SOSs to be created. So for example, if there's a special discount requested or special payment terms requested for this company, and these are populated, that will create those as well. So I'm going to go ahead and save this proposal. And I've got quite a few validation rules on it as well as this flow running in the background. So you're going to notice it takes just a little bit for it to save. What I generally told my users is that this is my built-in take a breath break. It may take you an extra 10 or 15 seconds for the proposal to save. However, I've just turned around and saved you about 30 to 45 minutes of work entering in all of those SOS records that you used to have to do by hand. So we'll just do a quick refresh here on that opportunities page. And then if I come over here to my related list, I can find my SOS object, and we'll pull that up momentarily. And so just in the course of creating a proposal, 19 different items were identified as needing some sort of follow-up. So all of these now I can go in and see. So for example, the additional trips. I've pre-populated all of the relevant fields. I've been able to link it to the appropriate account and the opportunity. I can identify its origin if it's in a status of identified, because this will actually go through a status process to be verified before we make sure that we put it into our contracts. And then the description here down has all of the information that was populated in that proposal request form. So I actually used a formula within my flow to put some information in and pull those fields over from the proposal request. So as far as how that works on the back end, again, I've got my proposal request created and my proposal request edited. So if I jump in here for my proposal request created, for example, you can see that my criteria is only when the record's created, and then for no criteria, go ahead and launch this. And then the thing that I'm doing with the lookups is I'm actually using the process builder from the record that triggered the process to pull in the fields on that record that populate the variables in my flow. So it knows what record I'm trying to look up in the system. So it's the current proposal request form and then the related opportunity and account. So that's how I can pass that information over to the flow so it knows what record to go look up. So then from here, I just wanted to jump in and kind of show you some of the information on a decision and the record create and update. So essentially, you're going to give everything a unique name, as I mentioned, and then your outcomes are basically based on things like your criteria in a process builder would be. So I could select different fields needed to have specific values, or if certain things were changed. So for example, I wanted to make sure that this additional company field was actually set, and as long as that is true, and it was set to yes, then it needs to go through that line. So in that case, it creates a record, and I was able to specify the value for all the fields on that record. So as you go through here, you can see all of the different values that I populated in here as well. And then finally, the update is where I basically do an assignment and say, look at the opportunity record, update a checkbox to true. And then down at the very bottom of the flow, once I've gone through all of the different potential decisions, the final thing that happens is I update that record with a fast update, and that is done using an S-object variable. So now all I have to do is tell it what record I want it to update, and it is the one that I've assigned to this particular S-object variable, and all of the fields that have been assigned throughout my flow are then updated all at once. Okay. So certainly I did not do this by myself. The Ohana has been incredibly helpful. There's a lot of wonderful content out there that helped me along the way. And so I'm always one about passing it forward and passing on the information that I have gained. So here are some of the resources that I tend to use the most. Trailhead certainly has a module on Lightning Flow. It actually covers both Flow and Process Builder. There's blogs out there about workflow rules versus process builder, several on introduction to flow. Jen and Rakesh both, we know, are automation superheroes, and so they both have blogs out there that focus a lot on automation. I use them probably every week at least. And then just a couple of other things that I found out there, as well as the unofficial flow sites that the product manager from Salesforce over Flow, Alex Edelstein, has started putting together some pretty awesome resources, and I'm really excited to dig into that a little bit more as well. So with that, I'll take any questions that we've gotten in the community, but I'm always happy to help. You can find me on Twitter or the success community, certainly. I'm always happy to help and pay it forward.
All right, thanks, Michelle. I am refreshing the Trailblazer community. So for those who joined late, we don't have our usual questions module on here, but we're using the Salesforce Automation Hour Trailblazer community to post our questions today. So I currently don't see any questions. It could be related to Michelle's presentation or any general process automation questions that folks might have. So we'll just give people a couple minutes. And while we wait, Michelle, when did you start learning Process Builder and Flow? Like how long ago was that?
I'd probably started using Process Builder just a little bit a couple of years ago. Really, I hadn't gotten into it too extensively, or definitely really hadn't gotten into Flow until probably just 5 or 6 months ago. So it's one of those things where, you know, once you start having a use case for it, you force yourself to learn it, and then as as you keep going, it got a little easier, and I'd learn a little more every day and find out some really cool stuff that it could do. One of the flows that I'm working on now, I learned how to do some loops and query some values that were in Salesforce places I didn't know how to get to until I read another blog.
All right, I'm feverishly refreshing. We usually have questions, everybody. What's up?
It's a Friday afternoon in August. It's probably beautiful weather, and everybody's excited to get out and enjoy it.
So when you were starting out with, I guess, Process Builder to begin with, was Trailhead out by then, or?
Yeah, I am so grateful. I have never had
a Trailhead learner
without Trailhead. I'm not sure what I would have done without Trailhead. But yeah, definitely there's some things on Trailhead, and reading blogs and even just Google searching, honestly, is how I find most of the answers. If you put in enough words of what you're trying to do and then you add Salesforce to the end, it comes up with a lot of good content. A lot of times even back into the Salesforce community itself.
All right, I have a question from the Slack Salesforce Ohana channel because she couldn't get into the Trailblazer community to post it. So Alex is asking, can you ask Michelle if she's used the Flow debug feature for this, and if she did, what was her impression?
Okay, I think the debugger is the best thing in the world since sliced bread or Betty White, who was technically older than sliced bread. The debugger saves my skin so much, I can't even begin to tell you how much the debugger saves my skin. Jen actually just did a wonderful blog post on the run button, which is a great way for you to test it once you've gotten everything up and running appropriately and you just want to do some kind of last minute run throughs, sort of a dress rehearsal. But while you're still developing, the debugger tool will actually walk you through everything step by step, and it will tell you what happens at each element within this. So for example, let's just run in here and debug it, and let me jump in here and pull. Okay, so I'm going to make one change to my proposal request, so when we do this, it'll actually no, that won't work. So I've pulled the record ID so I can do a debug, since I have to actually be able to populate my values. So what the debugger is going to allow you to do is you've got a few options with it while we're waiting for it to load here. Apparently my internet connection is being slow since I'm presenting. But you'll need to input any of your input variables here. So you'll need to be able to pull that record ID value. And if you didn't see where I got that, I just went to the actual record itself. And if you double click on this crazy little thing here, that is the record ID. So once I populate the record ID, I have options here. Run the latest version of each flow. So if there's subflows being called that have different versions, you can specify that. And then the show details is the most important thing here. Even if you don't use Lightning Runtime, it'll actually run it for you in the debugger mode in Runtime and give you all of the details. So as I hit run, you see, since this doesn't have any screens, it's just done. It did everything. But over here on the right, it literally pulls every element in and tells me what all of the values were that I asked for, and then what happened to them. So it looked up my proposal request and pulled all my fields. Then it did a lookup and pulled all my fields on the opportunity, and then the account fields that I asked for, and then it went through all of the different decisions. So because the default outcome is what went through, since I haven't made any changes to it, all of the decisions essentially are blank. That's how you know it went through the default outcome. And so then you can see down here at the bottom, the fast update, it's waiting. So anything that's edited is ready to be created. And actually this would go behind the scenes and update anything that we had potentially changed throughout this. So it's one of those things that you need to be careful of when you're doing this. Certainly I'll hammer probably the dead horse of always develop in a sandbox. Never do this in production because it will change your data and could potentially cause some errors. So, and that is how I did all of my testing. So as I would go through, I would create some test records, and I would specify one field at a time that I would change to see if it actually ran through the way I wanted it to. And if that one worked, then I'd go on to the next one. And at some point, I got pretty comfortable that I understood what they were, so I'd do them in batches. But then I tried every iteration possible of how this could go down. So if we have different proposal types, one for telecom and one for utility, I tested telecom, I tested utility. Again, like I said, the one thing that I failed to do is what happens if my sales managers just completely forget how to do their jobs one day and they submit a proposal request with absolutely everything blank, so absolutely everything fires. And that's how I ended up with a governor limit issue. So even the unlikely scenarios, you want to make sure that you try and think through, and really you're trying to put the guardrails up to keep your users on the path that you want them to follow. And so the more places that you can kind of troubleshoot and start with the, okay, what happens outside the perfect scenario? And then you go back and craft your, this is the plan I expect them to go through, but here's all the places that they could go wrong, have been taken care of already. It makes it easier.
Okay. Rita asks, is process builder with flow more likely to hit governor limits than workflow rules?
I think I'm going to have to crowdsource the answer to that because I have never used workflow rules enough to know about workflow rules and governor limits.
The workflow rules are, yeah, workflow rules won't hit them unless you're like using Apex or something, and for some reason you've got a ton of workflow rules and they like cause you to hit the CPU timeout or something. So workflow rules are like fully bulkified to where you don't have to worry about it.
Thanks, David. Okay, Raju asked, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Can you show your structure of the object for proposal? Do you have bundles for products?
We do not have bundles, actually. It's pretty much kind of like a Lego system where you can pull the products that you need in. There are some that we tend to, just quote together anyway, but we don't have any actual product bundles. So if I go back over to my proposal request, we get down to the actual product section here. So it's just individual products, and sometimes there's sub questions underneath it. As far as like, Remit Plus is something that actually scans check images instead of having to go through and enter paper check amounts manually. So there's a follow-up question there, how many items per year do you need? Because that's a third party that we integrate with, and they have license requirements as well. So it's by product. Pretty much you can Lego them together, and then I just pull other fields in for supporting information.
Okay, I think the only other question out there is, what was your process like for testing flow you shared here?
So the debugger was a big part of it, as well as just trying to come up with the different scenarios that my users would encounter. So again, if I had different proposal types, one for telecom, one for utility, running through different versions of both of those to make sure that they're covered, that they populate appropriately. Then also, like I said, think of your crazy scenarios, the things you don't ever expect to happen but potentially could, like if someone were to create a new proposal request record and leave everything but 2 fields blank and try and submit it, it's going to, go through every single one of those decisions and make sure that you have that contingency covered as well. So that way you can cover normal to abnormal and you won't run into any issues. The thing about flow is that when you run into that governor limit, or process builder for that matter, you can't save the record. You've basically put your user into a situation where they are stuck. The only thing that they can do is close the tab or navigate to another page. You can't save it for later. You can't do anything. And that was what I was really concerned about since I turned this on in production, is the fact that I didn't want my user to put all of this information into a proposal request and then be in a position to not be able to save it. So that meant I had to turn off all the automation until I could get it fixed. And while the first run through of this probably took me 3 weeks to a month to build through the process builders and gathering all the requirements, when I had to turn around and rewrite it in Flow, I think I managed to do it in 3 days. And knock on wood, thank you to my users, nobody managed to break it before I got it fixed. So nobody but me knew I broke it.
Cool.
And my boss, and my boss, I had to admit it to her.
All right. I do not see any other questions, but there are a lot of compliments out there on our Salesforce Automation Hour. So definitely, Michelle, go out there and take a look at all the compliments you got.
Well, thanks, guys.
Everyone thought it was fabulous, as well as the Salesforce Ohana Slack. So check that out as well. With that, I think we're going to close this call a couple of minutes early. Thanks so much, Michelle, for walking us through your process and lessons learned. I think a lot of people took things away from that. And we'd like to have you back again if you want to come back. So
I'd love to come back anytime you will have me. And just again, I'll put my Twitter handle up there. And anybody's more than happy to tweet me or find me on the Success community if you ever have questions. I'm more than happy to get on a call with you whenever and walk through something. You can ask Cheryl Feldman. I actually jumped on the phone with her last Friday night and we walked through a couple of flow scenarios. And it was a lot of fun. So.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, everyone, for joining Automation Hour. And we'll check you out in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.